The following is a presentation of the Steamboat Church of Christ in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. We hope that you find today's lesson, presented by our minister, Dr. Joseph Becker, informative, insightful, and inspirational.
Exodus 12, 21 through 22. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go and select lambs for yourselves according to your clans, and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and baptize it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the two doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. None of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning." Leviticus 4, 16 through 17. Then the anointed priest shall bring some of the blood of the bull into the tent of meeting, and the priest shall baptize his finger in the blood and sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil. Leviticus 9, 8 through 9. So Aaron drew near to the altar and killed the calf of the sin offering which was for himself. And the sons of Aaron presented the blood to him, and he baptized his finger in the blood and put it on the horns of the altar and poured out the blood at the base of the altar. Leviticus 11, 29 through 32. And these are unclean to you among the swarming things that swarm on the ground: the mole rat, the mouse, the great lizard of any kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the horny toad, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. These are unclean to you, as is everything that swarms. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until evening. And anything on which any of them falls when they are dead shall be unclean, whether it is an article of wood, or a garment, or a skin, or a sack, or any article that is used for any purpose. It must be baptized in water, and it shall be unclean until the evening. Then it shall be clean. Leviticus 14, 1 through 7. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "This shall be the law of the leprous person for the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall look. Then if the case of leprous disease is healed in the leprous person, the priest shall command them to take for him who is to be cleansed 2 live clean birds, and cedar wood, and scarlet yarn, and hyssop. And the priest shall command them to kill one of the birds in an earthenware vessel over fresh water. He shall take the live bird with the cedar wood and the scarlet yarn and the hyssop, and baptize them and the live bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the fresh water. And he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed of the leprous disease. Then he shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird go into the open field." Numbers 19, 14 through 19. This is the law when someone dies in a tent. Everyone who comes into the tent and everyone who is in the tent shall be unclean 7 days. And every open vessel that has no cover fastened on is unclean. Whoever in the open field touches someone who was killed with a sword, or who died naturally, or touches a human bone or a grave, shall be unclean 7 days. For the unclean, they shall take some ashes of the burnt sin offering, and fresh water shall be added in a vessel. Then a clean person shall take hyssop and baptize it in the water, and sprinkle it on the tent, and on all the furnishings, and on the persons who were there, and on whoever touched the bone, or the slain, or the dead, or the grave. And the clean person shall sprinkle it on the unclean on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. Thus on the 7th day he shall cleanse him, and he shall wash his clothes and cleanse himself in water, and at evening he shall be clean. 2 Kings 5, 13 through 14. But Naaman's servant came near and said to him, "My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? He has actually said to you, 'Wash and be clean.'" So he went down and baptized himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Now, all of these passages come to us not from the Hebrew Old Testament, but from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible commissioned by Ptolemy II in the 3rd century BC and completed 132 years before the birth of Christ. And all of the occurrences of the word to baptize in the readings that I just presented to you were supplied not by me, but by the Septuagint, which contains within it a number of uses of the word bapto, which means to dip into, or to immerse. Now, when the Septuagint was translated, it wasn't just Ptolemy who wanted a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible for his library at Alexandria. No, according to Brennan Breed, a professor at Columbia Theological Seminary, there were other Greek translations already underway by individual Jewish scholars when the Septuagint was commissioned. And quite apparently, the final edition of the Greek Old Testament included Greek translations from a wide variety of Hebrew and Greek scholars, most of whose names have been lost to history. However, it's not surprising that there were so many scholars working to produce a Greek Old Testament, because the Hellenization of the Hebrew world had begun 30 years before Ptolemy II was even born, with the conquests of Alexander the Great. And by the time Ptolemy II was on the throne, all of the Jews living in countries west of the Levant were speaking Greek as their everyday language, because come the time of the Ptolemaic kingdom, Greek had become the international trade language of the ancient Near East. So there was a high demand for Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, and because of the diaspora, there was no central Jewish authority to say yea or nay to such an undertaking. So Greek translations of various books of the Hebrew Bible abounded from the end of the 4th century BC to well into the life and ministry of Christ. And the Bible that was commonly read in the synagogues in Roman-occupied Palestine was the Greek Old Testament. And consequently, by the time of Jesus' baptism, the Jews were very familiar with baptism as a rite of purification. And because of the passages I read to you at the beginning of the lesson, they associated baptism with the blood of the Passover lamb, with the forgiveness of sins, with healing, and with overcoming the corruption of death. So when John the Baptist came along and began baptizing people for the forgiveness of their sins, he was not doing something completely novel, because the Jews of first century Palestine were familiar with baptism and already understood it as a means of purification, and a powerful means at that. Because as they understood baptism, it had protective power, exculpatory power, curative power, and the power to at least address death and keep it from encroaching on the lives of God's chosen people. And this is vitally important for apprehending today's lesson, they knew this rite by the same name that we know it, baptism. And this is important, because understanding that gives us the opportunity to clear up a misapprehension under which I, and I know many others, have operated for years. Because I had been taught, and subsequently I have taught others, that the English word baptism was coined by Bible translators as a feeble response to an intractable problem. And this is a pervasive point of view even among conservative Bible scholars. Indeed, an entire narrative has been built around what is largely a myth, but the narrative is false. You see, as the narrative goes, the Greek word bapto and its cognates were somewhat obscure and were used in a wide variety of ways prior to the writing of the New Testament. And because of this, there's a great deal of uncertainty about how to translate these words, so the translators of the King James Version simply cut the Gordian knot by supplying the authorized version of the Bible with a transliteration of baptisma rather than with a bona fide English word. Rather than dealing with the question, they instead coined a new English word, the word baptism, and left the questions for future generations to hash out. Consequently, as the narrative goes, there's never been a proper English word for baptism because no one could ever agree on a word, so they settled for the transliteration, baptism, which isn't even a proper translation because it isn't even a word. It's a faux word, a made-up word, a substitute for an actual English word. And I'm sure that you've all heard some version of this folk history. But beloved, this simply isn't true. The reason why those who translate the Bible into the common tongue do so is for common understanding. Translators do what they do in an effort to clear things up, to disambiguate the text, not to muddy the waters. And English translators, as a class, have never equivocated when it comes to translating the word baptisma and its cognates. And this goes all the way back to the very beginnings of the English language. In 360 AD, the scholars who translated the Gothic Bible had a clear point of view on baptism, and they consistently translated baptisma with one form or another of the Gothic word dipon, as you can see in the passage from Luke 3:7, which I provided for you, where the word daupion is used. Now, Gothic obviously isn't English as we know it, but it is the forerunner of Anglo-Saxon from which the English language springs. I almost said that properly. So, Gothic is a sort of proto-English. And in the Gothic Bible, baptisma and its cognates are consistently translated with various forms of the word dipon, or gedipon, which means to dip, to emerge, to baptize, or to immerse. And these words correspond with the Old High German taufi and dauphin and dafa, which means to baptize, to dive, to debut, to make an entry, to name, to unveil, or to launch, all of which relate to one aspect or another of baptism. And both the Gothic and the Old High German here are contemporary with the Latin, which was the international trade language of the 4th century, and in that same time frame was becoming the language of the church. And these words for baptism, chosen by the Gothic and German translators who rendered these translations, correspond directly both in time and in lexical meaning with the Latin word baptizare, which means to baptize, to immerse, to emerge, or to plunge into. And interestingly, even though only a few fragments of the Gothic Old Testament have survived, the lexical entries for the word dipon include references not just to New Testament baptism, but also to the Old Testament passages I read to you earlier, Exodus 12:22 and Leviticus 4:17, plus Psalm 68:25. Now then, 600 years later, in the Anglo-Saxon Bible, also known as the Wessex Gospel, we find that every instance of the Greek word baptisma and its cognates is translated with some form of the Anglo-Saxon word fulligena, whether gefulian, gefulwian, gefulwhiten, or some other form of the word, as you can see from the examples that I provided for you from Matthew 28:19, Mark 16:16, Luke 3:7, and John 1:26 through 27. And this is quite interesting, at least to me, because while the lexical definition of all these words starts with to baptize, various forms of the word convey various secondary meanings, all of which speak to one aspect or another of baptism. For instance, fulgeawian means to complete, to finish, or to equip fully. Fulwian or gefulwhiten means to make as white as fuller, to sanctify, or to consecrate. Gefulian means to full baptize, indicating immersion, to be brought to completion, or to perfect. And these words are all contemporary with the Old French baptiser, which means to be baptized, or to give a name to. And that brings us to the transition into Old English, and closer to the point that I want to make with this part of today's lesson. Because by the 14th century, English began to become more recognizable to us, such that the Wycliffe Bible, though difficult to decipher, is readable once you become accustomed to the unusual spellings of the words and some of the more obscure vocabulary. Now, the Wycliffe Bible isn't as consistent on this question as was the Anglo-Saxon Bible, which preceded it by 400 years, or the Tyndale Bible, which came 200 years later. Because though Wycliffe renders the Greek word baptisma and its cognates with the English word baptism most of the time, he sometimes uses the word christening, as you can see by the example that I provided for you from Matthew 28:19. However, even this is more consistent than you might think, because while in modern English the word christen conveys the sense of to sprinkle, in Old English, christenion literally meant to make Christian. and also conveyed the sense of to name. But by the 16th century, Tyndale had made the traductory choice of consistently using the English word baptism to render the Greek word baptisma, as you can see in the example I provided for you from Matthew 28:19. Now, why do you suppose that he chose the word baptism? Well, it wasn't, I don't think, because he was hesitant to commit to any one English word for fear of repercussions for taking a point of view on what baptism is. No, every Bible translator of which I'm aware has a theological point of view. And I haven't met one yet who's shy or apologetic about it when it comes to the work that they produce. And any translator who denies that his work is influenced by his own theology is lying, either to you or to himself. And he isn't to be trusted. So no, I don't think Tyndale was motivated by fear or indecision. Rather, I'm persuaded that the reason why he chose the English word baptism to translate the Greek word baptisma is because it was precisely the best word to communicate the depth and breadth of what baptism is. And his aim was to communicate the Bible precisely to the English speaker in the common tongue. And choosing the word baptism was part of that effort. You see, during the lifetime of Tyndale, the English language was in a state of comparatively rapid change because the European landscape was in a state of comparatively rapid change. And at the time when he published his Bible, Latin was on its way out as the international trade language of the European continent, and French was on its way in. And no language was having a greater impact on the evolution of English like French was having. And the English vocabulary was quickly being populated by borrowed words from French. And as I mentioned earlier, the Old French had the centuries-long established word baptisier, which was adopted into the English language as baptism at the beginning of the 14th century. As such, this may be one of the reasons why Wycliffe was inconsistent about using the word baptism in his translation, because it was a new word in his lifetime. And not knowing the future, he had no way of knowing whether the French influence on the English language was just a trend or if it had staying power. But by the time Tyndale was translating his Bible, the word baptism was well established in the English vocabulary. And this word had the benefit of having been received as the direct etymological descendant of the Greek word baptisma, because the English baptism comes from the French baptême, which comes from the Old French baptisier, which comes from the Latin baptismus, which comes from the Greek baptisma. And unlike many other words, when it comes to this word, the definition, and more importantly, the usage, has remained stable throughout all these transitions. Remarkably, for 2,000 years, across 3 continents, across 4.5 languages, and across countless cultures, the meaning and usage of the word baptism has not changed. In its biblical context, the English word baptism means exactly what the Greek word baptisma meant. And accordingly, the way that this word is used in the church now ought to correspond with the way that it was used in the church then. And that's what I want to dedicate the remainder of my lesson to this morning, what the word baptism meant to the biblical authors who received it as a full-grown word and then used it in the writing of the New Testament. And I want to start with the word bapto, which is the root word or the stem word upon which all the other permutations are built. Now this word is Strong's number G911 for anyone who wants to look it up and find the richness of its meaning. Now first, it means to dip or to bathe. But the dipping or bathing that's in view is not in water, but in a refiner's fire. And it refers to red-hot iron in the process of being tempered, or coral becoming hardened over time. And this, I think, affirms baptism as a starting point for the Christian life, a beginning point from which God refines us day by day. As it says in Proverbs 17:3, the crucible is for silver and the furnace is for gold, but the Lord tests the heart. And again in 1 Peter 1:7, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Second, the word bapto refers to slaughter in Greek tragedies. And in that context, it is used of those who are slain as martyrs for their cause. And this, as I understand it, affirms the fact that in baptism we present our bodies to the Lord as living sacrifices. As Paul says in Romans 12:1, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, for this is your spiritual worship. And as he says of himself in 2 Timothy 4:6-7, for my life is already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Third, bapto means to dye in the sense of to change the tincture of fabric or to alter the color of one's hair. And this for me brings to mind the image of a dyed-in-the-wool Christian and sheds light on passages like Revelation 7:13-14, where it says, Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, Who are these, clothed in white robes, and from where have they come? I said to him, Sir, you know. And he said to me, These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Fourth, bapto means to glaze or to gild. And this speaks to the fact that when we undergo baptism, we are tabernacled, body and spirit, in grace. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12:7-9, So to keep me from being too elated by the surpassing greatness of these revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to beat me down, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. And he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may be tabernacled upon me. And fifth, the word bapto is used to speak of the drawing of water by dipping a vessel into the water. And this brings to mind John 12:32, where Jesus says, And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people unto myself. Because the word draw in that passage doesn't mean that Jesus will attract people to himself or that he will beckon them. Rather, it refers to drawing of the sort that is done when water is drawn from a well. And this speaks not only to divine election, but also to the fact that in baptism we surrender ourselves to death, and the Lord raises us up from the watery grave to life. An act that is prefigured in Psalm 18:14-17, where the psalmist declares, He fired off a spray of arrows, shafts of lightning, strafing a broad swath. Then with a single breath of his nostrils, Yahweh suspired a sough of reproof, exposing the ocean floor, laying the foundations of the earth bare. Then reaching down from on high, he retrieved me, and purchasing me from the watery deep, he rescued me from the clutches of my enemies. After all, death is the final enemy to be defeated, and in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul makes it clear that the instrumental means by which we receive the grace that equips us to overcome death is baptism. Next comes the word baptizo. This word is Strong's number G907, and it means to dip repeatedly, to immerse, to cleanse by dipping or submerging, to wash, to make clean with water, to wash oneself, or to bathe. And this brings to mind Hebrews 10:19-22, where it says, Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Second, baptizo means to overwhelm, to submerge as of a vessel sinking, to drown, or to get into deep water in the sense of one who is head over ears in debt. And this harkens back to the trial of the refiner's fire and is evocative of the fact that in baptism we receive the Holy Spirit of Jesus Christ, which plunges us into a world in which the most intimate of things can be communicated in groanings which are too deep for words. And through the presence of the Spirit of Christ living within us, this same reality equips us to take on circumstances that would otherwise overwhelm us. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, 6 through 11, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' has made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our bodies the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our bodies. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life may also be revealed in our mortal bodies." And finally comes the word baptisma, Strong's number 908. Now, there are two other cognates, baptistes and baptismos, the first of which is redundant to everything I've already said this morning, and the second of which simply means one who baptizes. But the word baptisma is the word that I want to end with this morning. Now, just as with baptizo, the word baptisma likewise refers to immersion, submersion, and to calamities and afflictions with which one is quite overwhelmed. However, in addition, this is the word most often used in the New Testament to refer to John's baptism and to Christian baptism. And this, to my mind, closes the loop on all these lexical definitions of baptism. Because what I have tried to do this morning is to demonstrate complete, unbroken continuity between the English word baptism and the Greek word baptisma. Christian baptism is what it always was. And the word baptism means what it has always meant. The major translators in the history of the English Bible never copped out by using the word baptism. That was never a dodge. That was never a circumvention. No, they chose that word specifically because of its profound solidarity with the Greek word baptisma, and because of the rich history of translation embedded in that word through its etymology in French, Old English, Anglo-Saxon, Gothic, Old High German, Latin, and Greek. Because all of the things affirmed of baptism through the ways that baptisma and its cognates have been translated over the course of its English heritage over the last 2,000 years actually arise from that original Greek word family. And that's why the word baptism is the perfect English word to use, both linguistically and experientially, because the bapto word family is rich in meaning precisely because baptism is rich in substance. And these two things, the word baptism and the reality of baptism, together make up the foundation upon which the apostles understood baptism. And what I've done this morning is to begin to lay a foundation down for us in order to prepare us for the lessons in the weeks to come, in which I plan to explore what baptism meant to the apostles, not just by definition, but by their experience and by the reality of baptism. And that is where we will pick up next week. That's my lesson for today.
This has been a presentation of the Steamboat Church of Christ. We hope that you have found Dr. Becker's message well appointed. To hear more lessons like this one, visit our website at www.steamboatchurch.org or come see us at 1698 Lincoln Avenue in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. Bible classes are Sunday mornings at 9:30 and worship services are at 10:30. We look forward to meeting you. Until then, may the grace and peace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you.